I'd like to start by welcoming everybody to Something to Talk About. This is a regular program here at the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. We generally meet Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays online at Zoom. You can find previous conversations at youtube.com/BI Senior Center. We are grateful for the support from Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island. They offer memory care, independent living, and assisted living up on Rolling Bay, and they are accepting residents, and you can schedule a tour. To find out more, call 360-594-1010, and also ask about day stay and respite programs. We also like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering on the ancestral homeland of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water who have taking care of these lands and waters since time immemorial. We are grateful for their hospitality and we honor them. We also are very grateful today to have Florrie Munat join us today to talk about her book, Be Brave, A Wife's Journey Through Caregiving. Florrie is a writer, and it showed up in this memoir as a very clear and compelling read. That is certainly heartfelt, but also it's insightful not only for Florrie's journey, but for the journey that we all take as we age and work through loss in our lives. Florrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Reed, for asking me to be on, and thank everyone who came today. I appreciate it. And I too have a few people who asked if there would be a recording, and I guess there will be, so that's great. I wanted to begin just by saying a few things about caregiving in general. I read recently, and maybe you did too, that Rosalind Carter just celebrated her 96th birthday. And Rosalind is kind of a champion of caregivers. She started the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregiving in 1988. So that was really very forward thinking of her before caregiving really became more known as a public health issue. And she is also somewhat famous for this quote. She said, "There are 4 kinds of people in the world: people who have been caregivers, people who are currently caregivers, people who will be caregivers, or people who will need a caregiver." And I doubt if anyone on this call could say you weren't in one of those categories. And then another thought is that the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP do caregiving statistical surveys every few years. And in the most recent statistical survey, they indicated there are 53 million caregivers in this country, just in the United States. I figured out that's like 1 in 5 people provide unpaid care for a relative or a friend or a neighbor. And all that is really interesting to me looking back on my caregiving experience, because I don't think I even called myself a caregiver when I first started caregiving. I don't think I really knew what a caregiver was. I didn't identify with the word. And then suddenly I realized, hey, I'm caregiving. And certainly I actually felt very much alone, and it was not necessary, but I did. There are 53 million caregivers, but I felt I was like the only one that was going through this experience.
I think that one of the things that is so true about your experience is that we all, when we're thrust into a situation, don't have the connections to know that there are resources or other people out there. And so it feels very lonely for many, many people when they start caregiving, because they didn't know what it was going to be like, or that it was something that happens.
That's exactly right, Reed. I agree with you on that. I thought I would just begin, if you don't mind, with my describing to you how my caregiving began. And then, we're a small group, so we probably just open it up for questions. I have things I can address, but I like the idea of it being a group enterprise. So my caregiving journey began where Reed is sitting right now, at the Bainbridge Island Senior Center. My husband Chuck and I had gone to the senior center for our weekly Tai Chi class. And it was a beautiful June morning, sunny day, just an ordinary day, or so we thought. And when we finished the class, I walked up the hill and sat down on a bench up by the playground, Waterfront Park. And Chuck stayed behind for a little bit. And when he walked up to meet me, I could tell there was something terribly wrong with the way he was walking. He was just dragging his feet through the gravel and just didn't look like himself. And when he finally made it up to the picnic bench where I was sitting, he sat down and he said, "Why am I walking this way? I must be getting really old." Well, he was 69. It wasn't that old. But as he sat there, I could see the right side of his mouth droop. And I wasn't a nurse. I'm not a nurse. But that was a sign to me. So I took out my cell phone and I called 911. And when they said, "What is your emergency?" I reluctantly had to say, because I didn't really want Chuck to know. I said, "I think my husband's having a stroke." And he was. The EMTs came, they took us to Virginia Mason Hospital in Seattle. We were within that good window of time, within 3 hours of the onset, that we could do this therapy. It's called, well, not therapy, a procedure called TPA. I don't know what that means, but it in the vernacular, it's clot busting. So it wasn't a bleeding stroke. It was a stroke caused by a clot. And they did the procedure. They told me everything looked good. It went well. And he was probably going to recover and just be pretty much like he was before. But that is not what happened. He grew progressively worse. Every day I went into the hospital, he didn't know my name, or he couldn't walk, or he couldn't dress. And this was a man who the day before our Tai Chi class could walk, take care of himself, get dressed, cook, drive, and all of a sudden, nothing. He needed help with almost all the activities of daily living. So this was just mystifying, but he went on to stay at Virginia Mason for 3 weeks. He was in the ICU, then he was in neurology, and then he was in the rehab unit for about 3 weeks. Then he came back to the island. He still wasn't good enough really to come home. So we went to Island Health and Rehab for 3 more weeks of therapy, physical, occupational, and speech. And after that, he did come home for about 2 weeks, and I just could not handle him. I could not handle him at home. And this was really hard for me to accept, that I could not take care of him. One of the main reasons was he wasn't sleeping. And so he would get up and wander the house and fall down, and I'd be up with him, and then he could sleep the next day and I couldn't. And it doesn't take very long to make you pretty psychotic after you've not had sleep for several nights. So reluctantly, I had to readmit him to Island Health and Rehab, and things just continued to be mystifying. We kept waiting for this elusive recovery that never came. And finally, 4 months later, we had a neurologist do a SPECT test on Chuck's brain. And he came into the office after the test, and I was there, and a couple of my children were there, and some of their spouses were there. And the doctor just said, "The test shows discrepancies or abnormalities that are indicative of Lewy body dementia." So that was not definitive, but it was as close to definitive as you can get. And so that was just a huge turning point in our caregiving journey, because it meant there would be no recovery. There'd be no homecoming. He was going to be in Island Health and Rehab, probably for the duration.
And I'd say that often with dementia of all types, it's rare that you get a conclusive sort of diagnosis, but you can tell that something's wrong. And if there's a consistency with the story, then that's kind of what you go with.
Right.
And try to figure out how to work with life in this new way, which you did. I mean, when the title says "Be Brave," I know it talks about the sort of the end of life journey, but I think you had to find some bravery throughout the whole process. Both of you did.
That's right. I mean, that moment was when we began adapting to our new life, and it wasn't easy. Neither of us really accepted it for a while, but over time, we were able to do that. So that's kind of how things started for us, and I'm happy to hear any comments or questions that you've got now, or Reed, do you have comments?
Yeah, well, one of the things that touched me so much about your book, and I haven't completely read every page, but I've read a lot of it, was the honesty with which you talk about the how much you felt as though you were failing in the situation, and how you came to, not easily came to the understanding that that you did not have to feel responsible for the fact that things were not going well and they couldn't be fixed, and Chuck wasn't going to come back the way that he was. But boy, you sure, I mean, you talk about a dark night of the soul. I think you really explore that in a way that I think is probably helpful for many who are in the same or similar situations as you two were.
Well, I hope so. When I talk about caregiving now, I always talk about transformation, because that was the most transformative thing that ever happened to me in my life. And transformation isn't always easy. It's incremental. Sometimes you can't see it. And it just is, it shows me that suffering, as I think both Chuck and I were doing through that in the early days in particular, that's where things can really change. That's where transformation can really happen, when you're going through something difficult, some kind of unchosen circumstances that just won't go away, so you have to deal with them. And in dealing with them, I think that you become stronger. Someone gave me the analogy of, it's like when you pick up a baby when they're newborn, and you pick them up and, walk around with them, and then, they become 3 months old and 6 months old and 8 months and a year, and you're still picking up and carrying around. You don't realize I'm getting stronger because this baby is bigger. But, it happens so slowly, you don't even think about it. And that's kind of how I thought of my transformation as a caregiver. I mean, I wouldn't have even used that word when I was first caregiving. But I think definitely I'm a very different person than I was when I began. And probably Vanera can talk to that, because she knew me before and after, during and after, because she was running a support group that I was a member of. And they were people that really, really helped me by just allowing me to talk and not trying to fix it or solve what was going on with me. They just listened and told me they'd be there, and they were.
How did you find the group, Vanera's group?
Well, it actually started long before I started caregiving. It was a group for women with no particular theme. It was just like, okay, we're all in this together. Let's talk about it. Do you want to say something, Vanera? You're muted, I think.
I gave her a little,
Yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, well, Florrie and I go back a ways, and we on grade together. And I think what I learned from Florrie was unimaginable, because what she did was put her heart out, and this support group did help, letting us all in on it. And you're alone in this thing. It's not good. You need to talk to others who are experiencing hope. That way you don't feel so vulnerable. And he was putting in hours that were unimaginable, and told her, take a day off, for God's sakes. Oh, and she did. But it was hard on her. She could not lift that part of us that is ingrown in us, of being there for our loved ones, whether we like them or not. And I know she loved So that's
Well, and the other thing that comes through in the book is that what a dramatic transformation of your relationship with Chuck over the years. The love story shifted so much from your first meeting him to when you parted ways tearfully. And that's the transformation that, of course, we never see in our own lives until we look back.
and let
I'm
me
so
s-
grateful that you had this history or habit of making notes that you were
Okay.
able to use. I mean, that the detail of going through that is also the sort of thing I think we would forget if we didn't have notes.
Reed, if I may just add a little bit here. Through Florrie, I ended up with my own husband with Lewy Body disease. And had she not been the forerunner of this, um, I wouldn't have understood it. I'd have been angry at him. And maybe that's where all of our problems came in our marriage, because he was breaking down. And I didn't know it. There's so much for us to realize about mental health and the things that go on in it. But anyway, she was the forerunner on this one, and her book really told it all to me.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned, Florrie, is that idea with Lewy body that there's different levels of cognitive strength from one day to the next,
Right.
which could be very confusing, I imagine.
Yeah, emotionally confusing, especially you didn't know each day when you walked in, well, is someone rational going to be there or someone who's, thinks that there are soldiers in the room with us, or there were some hallucinations. I'd like to give you a specific example of how Vanera and her group helped me. Chuck died on a Saturday night, and on somewhere during that time, Vanera said, "What can we do to help?" I said, "Well, I have to clean out his room at the nursing home on Monday. Could you?" She said, "We'll be there." So 10 o'clock on Monday morning, there were 6 people in the support group. My son was there too. And we stood around in a little circle and we had some prayer, if you will. And then those women just went to work and they took care of all the things in his room. They took his clothes to Goodwill. I just couldn't face that. And afterwards, my son said, "Mom, they were like a SWAT team." They just went through that room and cleaned it. And then, yeah, it's hard to figure out how to help people who are going through a difficult time, but they figured it out.
Yes,
I,
Vanera?
I have so many things running through my head because of this. Florrie has not been just a sit around woman anyway. He has helped in the blind industry and doing. Tell it to me, Florrie.
Oh, yeah. You were helping with reading for books for the blind,
Blind.
talking book and braille.
Right.
So, I mean, people who stay involved can't get too far away from the caregiving.
Yeah, and you at one point in the book reflect on, I think you're going to do a recording and you're like, what's the point? I think that's another thing that we all need to recognize as part of this journey. It's it's sort of part of it to recognize that sometimes you're going to feel like, what's the point? You want to say anything about that?
Well, definitely that day that I described in that chapter of the book was just a really, really down day. And I thought that my emotions, I thought I was done with that. Okay, I was depressed at the beginning and got rid of that. It's like, oh, here it is again. So I think part of adapting to caregiving or any difficult experience where there's a lot of emotional upheaval involves accepting your own emotions. Just whenever they pop up, it's okay. That's how you're feeling now. That's how you should be feeling now. Don't try and say like, "Oh my God, I don't want to feel that way. There's something wrong with me." No, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just a human being experiencing emotional turmoil. So,
The other thing that I heard in at one point in the book was you were talking about how you weren't, and maybe the word wasn't caregiver in your head, but you weren't really thinking of yourself as a caregiver because Chuck was not living with you. But I think that it's clear in the book how much support we can give, even if we aren't sharing the same house. We're sharing a lot of attention. We're thinking about the other person and what they might need. You talked about, I guess, at the end when you're trying to figure out what the cause of death was, the CNA, the nursing assistant on staff, is asking you to help figure out what to put in the form.
yeah. Yeah, you have to you have to help out as much as you can. I mean, I guess one thought is that when you quote unquote put someone you love in a nursing home, that means that's the end of it, and or there's something wrong with you. I certainly felt guilt and failure over that until I realized how much work was actually involved being someone's advocate when they're in a skilled medical facility like Island Health. It's really helpful, as Venera, I think, has found out that you're there and you can stave off some of the things that might have happened to them. And it's no fault of the staff, really. It's just the nature of the job. But yeah, I mean, even when I wasn't there, I was probably thinking about him. So, I mean, he was always on my mind. And so it's probably more than most people think, having someone in a skilled medical facility like Venera.
Yeah, I'll get to you in just a second, Venera, but I wanted to ask, when you were figuring that out, the transition, Florrie, from being trying to have Chuck at home to realizing that he was going to be at Island Health and that made more sense for both of you, but he didn't want to be there, and part of you didn't want him to be there. And people were saying, like Venera said earlier, take some time off, take a day off. And of course, you didn't really. How did you come to recognize the value of what I guess we could call self-care, of thinking about taking care of yourself in this process?
Slowly. I had a lot of people, good people around me telling me that you got to slow down. You can't go to the nursing home at 8 in the morning and leave at 8 at night. That is not a life for you. It's not a good life for him. And even when I cut back to just afternoons after his dementia diagnosis, it was still a lot of time and a lot of difficult time. I mean, when you're in a skilled nursing facility like that, it's not exactly uplifting most of the time, even when I could take him out for a drive and so on. So I think, I had a therapist who encouraged me to find a new life for yourself. This is going to be it. And you don't know how long, but you will be alone probably after a while, and you need to have things in place for that. I just say to people when they wonder about that question about how much time should I spend, is that caregivers have limits, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we have different limits. I knew someone at the same time that was caring for her husband at home. He had Lewy Body Dementia, probably worse than Chuck. And she just did not want him to leave home. So she did that. I couldn't have done that. My limits were different than hers. And your loved one has to be safe. And he was not safe at home. He said he wanted to come home, but I think what he really wanted was not to be sick. I think he would have been just as poorly off at home as he was in the nursing home, and I would have been probably dead.
Yeah, your description of the brief time that he was home was harrowing, with you both up in the middle of the night and falls, and I mean, that's no way to live.
I can't read that chapter.
Sorry to bring it up.
No, it's okay. I mean, I've reread the book a few times. I just reread it in preparation for this talk, and I just skipped that chapter. I can't read that chapter.
I can understand that. Rita, you have a comment?
I said to my daughter and son-in-law a few years ago, when they first put up that new dementia thing at up by the church off of New Brooklyn there. And we were driving and I said, and my daughter said, oh, look, Mom, she goes, there's going to be your place, you know, when we can't keep you at home. And my son-in-law, my young son-in-law he was horrified. And I said, listen, there may be the time may come when I need to be someplace where I'm safe and that you guys can't care for me at home. So, and so I said, that is what might have to be, to happen. Because sometimes you get this whole thing, I'm going to care for everybody at home. I know that I would probably not be a good patient at home under certain circumstances. So I've already told them that if that needs to be, it's not going to be a problem. We'll see when the time comes.
Well, that's very generous of you.
Well,
Yeah, another thing that struck me was when Chuck decided at the end of his life to stop eating and drinking, which is a option, really the only option for self-determination for people with dementia, because of the rules around that, the laws of right to die. That seemed kind of obviously hard for you to hear, and also challenging to think about how it might have enforced itself. But it seemed like it was an example of how Chuck was Chuck all the way through his life.
Well, you got to know him well then, as you read the book, because that is exactly right. No, I knew he wanted to be in control, and there was so little he was in control of. And I was really pleased that he was able to talk to his doctor about it. The doctor was able to say, if I were in your shoes, I might pick the same option. And so he had that generosity, and he knew Chuck, and Chuck didn't actually stop eating and drinking. He just would eat and drink when he felt like it, but he kind of made this decision, and hospice accepted him, even though he didn't seem to be terminal. Maybe Carol, you could speak to that, but because Carol used to work with Kitsap Hospice, but they allowed him in, and 3 months later he died. So it was a good decision, and I'm glad that he could do that, because I had no power over how his life would end, but he did, and he took that power and he ran with it. And
I happened to be living on Bainbridge Island at the time that Florrie and Chuck were on this journey, and been close to Florrie for a long time. I think for Chuck, and I didn't know him that well, but I knew him mostly through Florrie, but he still retained that ability to make decisions, and that's where it becomes a little difficult, especially with hospice. And when I lived up there, I did work with hospice for a while. They will take people under those circumstances if they are convinced that the person knows what they're doing, and they're not going to be aiding the person to die, but they're respecting their wishes. And if they wish to stop eating and drinking, which is fairly common when you get onto hospice, or even without hospice, you just decide, I'm ready. And you stop doing the things that are keeping you going. And it can be a harrowing process for the caregiver and for the people in the family to see that. That's very difficult. But at the same time, it's affirming to know that this is what the person wants. This is what your loved one wants. And we're supporting them in that. It's hard, but it is very, I don't want to use the word uplifting, but it teaches you some lessons about life and death that are important for everyone. So, yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that Chuck and I were somehow in sync about that and other things, because right before he made that decision, I remember talking to your group, Rhaenyra, and saying, I am so tired now. I don't know if I don't know how much longer I can do this. And it wasn't much later that Chuck said, I'm done. You know, I can't feed myself anymore. I can't leave the facility. Those are two things that I need to have quality of life, and I don't have them anymore. And so let's just end this. And yes, it was hard, but I was so relieved that he made the decision. And as I say, we were both pretty tired. It was 6 years of him in the nursing facility, and that was
We all felt it that day, Florrie. Amazing how close we could get into each other's spirit. I can't say enough about getting enough people around you to play angels, whatever you want to do with it. But have them available, always communicate, because with some jewel. And we need them. We both reached that place. I think you had a good, I hate to say a good leaving, because you were able to take a breath and really understand the love that you had between you to begin with. If you don't love somebody enough, I had to re-love my husband. Care enough to want to take good care of him again. And I started remembering, like, it was a privilege.
Yeah. Another thing that happened in terms of our transformation, I guess you could say, was another thing that I feel about caregiving, which is that it's always reciprocal. That if you look hard enough, you will find gifts being given to you by your loved one. And they'll be different for everyone. But for me, one of them from Chuck was humor. I mean, he would say the most outrageously funny things, sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes intentionally. And you know, I just got a big kick out of him a lot. And love, you know, the capacity for love and the embodying of what it's like to live in a skilled nursing facility and just adjust to it. And doesn't mean he liked it ever, but he learned to live there, and he didn't give me a hard time. You know, he just was grateful I came to see him and was his warrior on occasion.
I'd like to take this opportunity to say what I did with fighting. Everyone in my family wrote a little statement about him as he was declining, and what part he played in their lives. And we read it to him, and it was the most profound, meaningful thing I've done. I can't tell you. He cried, he understood, and he felt it, that his family felt that way. He didn't know that.
It's
And
beautiful.
I think we should do that with our family.
Yeah, that idea of not waiting to tell somebody what they mean to you is great advice, Vanera. Yeah, you were talking about the gifts and the appreciation. At the end of a chapter about, I don't know, early in the book, he's at the skilled nursing facility, and he's asked, what is the worst thing about your life right now? And he says, being institutionalized. But you understand why you have to be here. And he says, oh yes, Florrie could never take care of me at home. And what is the best thing about your life now? Everything Florrie does for me. Even though, you know, when you're reading this book, you think he's having the most miserable day over and over again. There were these moments where he was aware of what you were doing and how you were together. That's beautifully captured.
Yes, I thank you. I hope people, when they read this book, don't expect it to be sad and, you know, horrible and description of what it's like to live in a convalescent nursing home. I call it my love letter to Chuck. Because it really describes what our entire marriage was like, not just the last years. And now thinking back on him, he's been gone for several years now, but I don't think so much about the nursing home years. I think more about the other times before the nursing home became a reality for him. I'd also just like to take a moment to explain where the title came from, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that was one of my questions for sure.
Well, you
Please.
know the answer, I think, if you've read it. I wasn't sure I wanted to call it Be Brave because I thought people might interpret that as like, oh, well, just have a stiff upper lip and, you know, soldier on and all that. But the title came from Chuck. And it's when he started, when he made the decision to stop eating and drinking. And the doctor and the director of nursing were on board with that. And the doctor said, well, we should involve hospice. So they left the room and I got Chuck settled back in bed. And then I said to him, I'm going to go home now and call hospice. And he said, be brave. And I was so touched that he realized that this was going to have an effect on me, that it was going to be hard for me to make that call. So it just kind of became my mantra, be brave. So.
Well, and it shows up at the end of the book too.
Yeah, yes.
Can you say anything about that experience?
Well, this was sure, this was the epilogue. Spoiler alert. I had decided I would, 4 months after he died, that I would take a trip. We used to travel a lot together. And I thought, well, when he dies, I'll just be traveling all over the place. But when he died, I just didn't want to go anywhere. I was just wanted to stay home. I was terrified of traveling. But 4 months later, I said, okay, I'm going to take a trip to visit a couple of friends in Chicago. And I've got to the airport, and I hadn't been in the airport before. This was long before, you know, the TS. Well, when I traveled previously, it was before TSA. And so I got there and there's huge lines to wait in. And I was sort of like, oh my God, what is this? But I finally got through those lines and I went out to the end of the concourse to wait for my flight. And suddenly I just realized, like, I'm never gonna travel again with Chuck. That's in the past. That's not gonna be possible anymore. And of course, I knew that up here, but I didn't know that in here. And I just got overwhelmed by this thought that, you know, he's gone. He's really gone. And I was about to cry into my cup of tea when I saw this young woman walking towards me, and she had a backpack on and she had a t-shirt that was like bright lime colored with white letters on it. So I was kind of looking at her to see what the t-shirt might have said. And as she came by me and she walked past my table, I saw that the words on the shirt were "Be brave." So I thought, well, he's going to keep teaching me. He's around. I don't know how he did that one, but God bless him, you know. So I thought, well, I'm not really feeling really brave right now, but I think I can get on the airplane and we'll see what happens after that.
Yeah, that's the way I felt about it. It was like, it's not, it's more of a statement to to kind of hold on, it's going to work out. Than some sort of stiff upper lip and you can do it on your own.
Yeah.
You have to remember there's a t-shirt for every saying.
That's true. And if you want one, they can print you one right now. But we don't know where that one came from. It came out of the universe right into Florrie's consciousness.
That's right.
Unbidden.
That's really right. I have something I could read. I don't know if we're ready to wrap this up or not, but you wanted to read something to read, or maybe you could read it and I won't.
No, go ahead. What would you like to share?
Well, this is from chapter near the end of the book. It's actually the chapter about when he decided to stop eating and drinking, but I just sort of do a little review here. I say, After almost 6 years of the daily nursing home routine, Chuck and I had grown closer in deeply spiritual ways. We didn't always need words to communicate. Our new intimacy was both unanticipated and undeniable. Although incremental losses surrounded us, we were not overcome by them. During his time at Island Health, I had come to love the new Chuck, who was simply a different manifestation of the old Chuck. They were interwoven parts of the same man, and I loved the Chuck who sat before me in his wheelchair as much as the one who had stood beside me at the Connecticut waterfall the day we promised to be husband and wife for as long as our love shall last. Well, it had lasted a good long time, 41 years. Although our lives had become ensnarled in the tentacles of Lewy Body Dementia, even illness could not take away what we'd always had, an abiding love and respect for each other. And that kind of love does not come to an end.
Thank you. And yeah, that spirit is throughout the book. And there are a lot of sections about how you met and how you came to be crossing paths with Chuck in the first place. So as you said earlier, it's a love story that does not just encompass this part of your lives together.
And it's not over yet. I'm still in love with them.
That's wonderful. Here's the section I wanted to share, which is from chapter called To Remember and Celebrate the Life of Chuck Munat. At the end, it says, does grieving make us better or stronger? If we push through it, will we feel better? Certainly, grieving marks our souls with a searing intensity. Just as external scars indicate where our bodies have been torn, sorrow creates internal scars. One night when I was 5 years old, I tripped over a metal toy truck and cut my shin. My parents drove me to the emergency room where it took 11 stitches to close the wound. A week later, my pediatrician took out the stitches slowly and agonizingly, the way doctors had to do in those days. He somberly pondered the half-moon scar on my leg, raised his eyes to look at me and nodded, "You're going to have that scar for a long, long time." 6 decades later, I still have that half-moon scar on my leg. What are the odds I will ever lose my internal scars, the ones I bear from having lost the love of my life? The good news is I don't want to lose them. That sorrow is a part of who I am now, a part of my mysterious journey. And contrary to everything I once believed, I wouldn't change it if I could. Wherever I find love in my life now, I know Chuck is there. That's what a wonderful memory, epitaph, forward-looking statement.
I'm glad you read that instead of me.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Florrie, for going through this. And I think your encouragement in the book and today about how caregiving should not be a solitary journey. Venera, you echoed that. There are resources. I mean, people can certainly call the Senior Center for referrals of caregiving groups, and we have a dementia group that meets here once a month. And then there can be groups that are not directly tied to your situation. You were talking about the women's group that turned into a support group over time. A book group or some group you meet for coffee or tea is the way that you can start to share what's going on. So, yes, Florrie.
I just you just reminded me that we have a resource called Open Mic for Caregivers, which is a Zoom meeting that occurs on the first Fridays at 4. It's supported by Grace Church, but there's no religious affiliation with the show. And I'm the facilitator of that. I find speakers once a month to come and talk about some aspect of caregiving. Sometimes they're caregivers themselves. Sometimes they're people like Reed, who was on the show once to tell us about community resources for caregivers. So anybody who's interested in that, please let me know. I'll put you on the mailing list and we can let you know. I think Rita would like to be on that. Can you just shoot me an email?
Yeah, and I will, if anybody is watching this later and wants contact with you, certainly just let the senior center know. We'll put you in contact with Florrie.
That'd be great. Yep.